Welcome to the Antedote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gujel.
Yeah, I think we're going to go maybe a little over our normal period of time here, about more on the lines of about 80 minutes, possibly 75 to 80 minutes, and gives us a little more of a window to discuss the topic that we are going to be discussing in depth here, which is an analysis of the recent TruNews broadcast of Rick Wiles and Doc Burkhart breaking down what they called the, quote, Jew coup against President Trump. And we're going to get into that here in depth because I feel it's very important to discuss this and tie in, I think, just how this is a real example of the kinds of, I think, what we want to call counterintelligence we kind of do within what we call the alt media. But before we do that, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to I just hope everybody who's listening to us now has had a chance to listen to our most recent program, which was the end of chapter 10 of Seth Abramson's Proof of Conspiracy, which I think that regardless of whatever shortcomings Abramson has in terms of his political ideology or blind spots that might be there, I think that this has been some of the best breakdowns of the global nature of the various entities on a global scale who had a vested interest in seeing someone like Donald Trump become the president elected into office. And so we finished that chapter, and I think we talked about a couple of points that bring in particularly Israel's, Russia, but also China in terms of a country that's not really discussed very much by Abramson, but that he has mentioned in the context of his book is related to the Orchids of Asia day spa scandal and the outing, which of course was the epicenter for the outing of New England Patriots owner and heavy Zionist friend of Donald Trump's, Robert Kraft. But we brought together a few things I think are important, which was one, I think we zeroed in a little bit on the nature of the hardline Zionist policies that Donald Trump administration is pushing in favor of Israel and the effects that these have in a manner of, number one, yes, reasserting that the U.S. is the arbiter of the protector of Israel in terms of giving major things to the Israeli Zionist state that other presidents and other politicians have not been willing to do, but also into how this, I think we discussed how this fits into a further splitting of America in terms of moving, of really creating even further tension geopolitically between the Trump administration, kind of the insurgents within the Trump administration and what the philosophy and the hardline views they represent, and what we know is the American bipartisan consensus, which has been to protect Israel as a powerful state in the Middle East, perhaps the powerful state in that region, but also not to really push these hardline policies that are very much the religious right-wing dreams of things like having an embassy in Jerusalem and having control of the Golan Heights, which is part of what we would call Greater Israel, and this unlimited settlement building that the Trump administration has recently passed, and how this creates tension, I think fits into this bigger picture of this global collusion, you can call it whatever you want, that goes on. We also got into Russia and continued to talk about the role of Leonard Blavatnik in financing politicians on both sides of the aisle, particularly how Blavatnik funding might be influencing Republicans such as Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, to name a few, to maybe be more overly defensive of a president who is seen as being so pro-Russia as Donald Trump is, and their possible motivations for poo-pooing anything for the most part related to impeachment or collusion or any type of wrongdoing in this whole Ukraine shindig that's going on. And lastly, aforementioned, we did dig into the China angle of this and the many right-wing politicians, media figures who have been seen as taking photos with this Chinese-American day spa owner of this Orchids of Asia spa, and how this might figure into the whatever bigger game is going on with China in terms of this war between the Trump administration and the Chinese government and those angles. But I think we tried to tie all of this into what we call the multipolar world in terms of the shifting of power from the West via the U.S. and Western Europe to the East, more into this Russia-China, China might call it axis, so to speak, with Israel at the still at the epicenter, much like it is in terms of this Western current global hegemonic entity that's been in power for so long. So that's just a few minutes there to kind of break down what we discussed on our last show. And so just finishing the chapter, so to speak, on that altogether.
Yes, well, thank you for breaking that down. And before we get started on the specificity of this broadcast, I just want to point out we're recording on December 9th, 2019, and the what's being called Afghanistan papers have been released by the Washington Post, saying that the title is Confidential Documents Reveal U.S. Officials Failed to Tell the Truth about the War in Afghanistan, I think it says. And this fits in, I believe, to what you mentioned about this question of East and West, Israel as a pivot point. And I just want to put it on the table that we are looking into questions of how throughout recent American history, or, last 50 to 75 years of American history, there's been a whole series of these people who have played the role or been for real, been serious about their anti-communism. And that would include all the way from back in the era of Roy Cohn being the main legal aid to Joseph McCarthy, through the question of James Jesus Angleton sitting at the head of both CIA counterintelligence and the Israel desk, his close relationship with Israel, and his close relationship with Soviet and Zionist agent Kim Philby. And then moving into closer to the end of the 20th century, the figures of Charlie Wilson, infamous from Charlie Wilson's War, and the whole background here, of course, of the Afghanistan War, 9/11, Al-Qaeda, the Mujahideen, all dates back to this question of Charlie Wilson, his involvement with certain what have been some people defined as rogue CIA elements in helping arm via Israel, we should point out, because the CIA did not want to arm these specific factions, but Charlie Wilson using Israel to arm some of the more incompetent and anti-Western aspects of what became the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets, that being Hekmatyar, I think his name is, while there was others, i.e. Al-Haq, who were much more maybe organic, actual tribal leaders, very much more effective warriors, much more potentially friendly to Western relations, who were not put front and center, both in that original aspect when it was about the Soviets, but then also post 9/11. And I just point out, look, did Tulsi Gabbard yet call the Afghanistan war a regime change war? I'm still waiting for that. And
so, maybe she could throw that in when she talks about how 9/11 constantly talks about how September 11th inspired her to join the military to fight the terrorists who attacked us.
And then, of course, the last figure I wanted to bring in that we will, work on a framework to think about this question of the framing of the old Cold War and the pivotal role of Israel in the midst of all of that, versus what's now called the new Cold War, with Israel's central role in that too, and why it is that these severe so-called anti-communists seem to be those that create the strongest relationships with Israel, which more and more looks like a dual-faced entity in relationship to East versus West in many ways. And so then the last thing there, of course, is John Tower, and then thinking about Jonathan Pollard as that era of Charlie Wilson and John Tower being understood as an Israeli agent, but in the background, of course, is the question of him being a Soviet cutout, really.
And I think this is very important. I thank you for bringing this up, and look forward to us discussing this maybe even as soon as our next weekly show that we put out for No Lies Radio, our next 60-minute broadcast. But this is very important, even when you look at this double game that goes on in terms of this very Israeli-centered playing of both sides during the Cold War, and this idea of the anti-communists being so over the top, so overtly pro-Israel. And I think this is very important today. And you mentioned the context of East and West, and this becomes very important when you think about the people such as, of course, Steve Bannon and what he represents, with the combination of the heavy Zionism of Breitbart and the Mercer family, along with his push to bring traditional religious populism back to America and back to the West under the guise of Judeo-Christian values, and of course a big-time opposition to communism and the twin evil in their eyes of socialism, which of course is represented by people like Bernie Sanders. And so I think this is a narrative. Continues to really play out in a very important manner to this day. And I think this is going to be a major focus of our show going forward. And even in the future, I think when we start to get into things like even what is called the Red-Brown Alliance in some circles, and this coming together of ostensibly diametrically opposed interests as far as the far left and the, quote, far right are concerned, in areas where their respective views of the world and respective goals for geopolitically in particular kind of come together in a very strangely symmetrical manner. So definitely I'm looking forward to getting into the nature of this analysis of Afghanistan as a key point of this long-term, going back to the Cold War and continuing to this day, nature of this very much playing both sides of conflicts and basically stoking the tensions in what seems like a very preconceived way. So
yeah, let's get into it. The TruNews, quote unquote, Jew coup broadcast, highly relevant because it was followed up again by another broadcast on Friday. And then, of course, today, Monday, December the 9th, as we record right now, the House Judiciary Committee is having an impeachment hearing. So all of this is highly immediately relevant, I would say.
Yes, and so the show we're going to be discussing particularly here is from November 22nd, which is titled Jew Coup, Seditious Jews Orchestrating Trump Impeachment Lynching. And this video is actually taken off of YouTube in the Anti-Defamation League, went after Rick Wiles and TruNews for posting this, calling it, anti-Semitism and a reinforcing of every quote-unquote anti-Semitic trope that's out there. And while, of course, we don't agree with the way the ADL puts it, obviously, I mean, there is a lot of truth in that, as we're going to break down in this, I think, in this summary / in-depth breakdown of this program, that the program in question. And the most recent show that you just mentioned was from Thursday, December 5th, actually, Impeachment Coup, Countdown to Civil War, where Rick Wiles lays out his recent dream that I guess God had showed him of the coming civil war to America. And so in the process of this conversation, I think we're going to bring that show into this as well. And any quick thoughts before we really just start breaking down this? I think some of the important points I got from this this November 22nd Jew coup airing.
Before you dive deep into the breakdown of the quote-unquote Jew coup show, would you explain the what they addressed on that more recent show in terms of the Nancy Pelosi being
let's
questioned?
Do that now, actually.
Okay, yeah, because I think it's a good framing understanding of what they do in a way.
Yeah, let's do that now. So on Thursday, December 5th, about 20 minutes into this hour and a half TruNews broadcast, Rick Wiles begins to discuss a vision that he was given, like a dream of civil war coming to America. And it's interesting that it appears that the inspiration for this dream that Rick Wiles has recently had came from a clip of Nancy Pelosi being asked if she hates Donald Trump. And I guess Wiles took this clip as proof of like I guess the evil and inherent in the hearts of some of these anti-Trump Democrats that. But anyway,
and it was after Nancy Pelosi had given this briefing to the press about that the Democrats were going to be pursuing writing up articles of impeachment in the House.
For sure, and I think we have in the past, and we will in the future, perhaps talk more about the nature of what Nancy Pelosi and her ilk may or may not actually want to gain from an impeachment process and expose in that realm. But in the context of this dream, this was inspired by a clip of Nancy Pelosi being asked if she hates Trump. And it's interesting, the person who asked this question is a man by the name of James Rosen. Now, James Rosen he's Jewish. I suspect, certainly looking at the kind of people he associates with, the media outlets he associates with, as being very, very much within the Zionist milieu.
Yes, I think he's known as being highly AIPAC, not only associated, but almost with as a conduit for AIPAC.
For sure. But it's interesting that Rosen was he was with Fox News. It's also interesting that he was a researcher for Dan Rather at CBS News, when you consider Dan Rather's history of basically almost, you might want to say, making his bones, so to speak, by pretty much lying about the nature of the gunshot of the assassination of Kennedy, and where the shot hit Kennedy, and where Kennedy's head went and didn't go in terms of the video of the JFK assassination. So it's interesting. He started out with, or at least at one point was a researcher for Dan Rather, and he moves on from there to Fox News, where
let me just point out Rather. It's a very interesting. I just thought of it as you pointed it out, that he had this background of. I think he had originally he reported on the Kennedy bullet in a way that actually fit the physical facts, and then backtracked or was silent on it. Right? Is that the case?
Very interesting.
Yeah. I think that's the case. And then I would say it's similar in that in September 11th, he was the biggest mainstream reporter who reported on the evidence of the Middle Eastern, as he termed it, I think, the question of the white vans, the Israeli intelligence white vans, and the explosives and all of that. And since then has not said a word about that.
That's in addition to mentioning that that what happened at the World Trade Centers looked a lot like those controlled demolitions we've seen so many times. He actually said that on air. And he also compared the post 9/11 journalism environment to like being necklaced in South Africa, which is having a tire wrapped around your neck and set on fire. So very interesting in that regard. But anyway, James Rosen moved on to Fox News, where it turns out at the end of 2017 he left after basically being Me Too'd, all kinds of claims of sexual harassment against coworkers, both overt physical and sexual overtures, quote unquote. And so that was, James Rosen went from being Me Too'd at Fox News on to this Sinclair Media. And I got a glimpse of just how influential Sinclair Media is as a conservative media empire when I was living in Iowa for about a year and a half. Everywhere you go in the state of Iowa, all these local television channels are Sinclair Broadcasting affiliates. So you get a lot of Sinclair programming. You get it's much more of a right-wing take on the news as you would get from what we know as the liberal media. So James Rosen, in his job as a reporter at Sinclair News, was the person who asked Nancy Pelosi this question about hating Donald Trump. And anyway,
and one quick thing about Sinclair is, remember that infamous video that was online? It was actually during the 2016 campaign, I think, that it hit its peak, where it was a video of all of these local news broadcasters saying the exact same line. And the way it was mainly portrayed at first was that this was the New World Order scripting, broadcasts of all different sorts. But it turned out it was Sinclair Media. That was what that was a video of the distribution of Sinclair Media talking points from corporate HQ out to their on the ground offices in place like Iowa.
That was a great example of just how these things that like the deep state establishment media is, I think, in many cases rightly accused of doing, as far as pushing and parroting talking points given to their reporters that are repeated incessantly. We've got an example of the exact same thing playing out here with Sinclair, just even in a way that's more overtly obvious than, say, outlets such as CNN and their many affiliates that they might have nationally. So this was a very obvious example of a blatant propaganda script being passed down to reporters all over the country.
And it being painted as by what's the sort of the Alex Jones style sort of pseudo-Christian right, like the liberal media New World Order coming to get you.
Yeah. And so anyway, our point was, in the context of this dream that Rick Wiles had of these subversive Jews, that's how he describes it, basically fomenting a civil war, and the conservative response to it, which is to really fight back, comes from a question asked to Nancy Pelosi by this very Zionist former Fox News, current Sinclair broadcast affiliate, James Rosen, who was basically Harvey Weinstein out of his gig at Fox News. So that's the detail that it seems that Rick Wiles very conveniently leaves out of his Jew coup narrative, just as I'm very sure he's not going to address, or if he does, it will be in a very, and we'll have to keep a tab on this if he addresses at all, this recent Israeli-American Council event with Sheldon and Miriam Adelson that Donald Trump just addressed, where he gave a shout-out to a lot of his very Zionist real estate buddies, such as
Steve Roth.
Steve Roth of Vornado Properties.
Let me quote Trump. This is what he said. Trump at this event, the IAC with the Adelsons, quote, "We have to get the people of this country to love Israel more. I have to tell you that. We have to do it. We have to get them to love Israel more, because you have people that are Jewish people that are great people. They don't love Israel enough."
And then I believe it was the Times of Israel came out with the headline that Trump tells Jews to vote for him because he'll protect their wealth. And this was then responded to by Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, who was at this event, who came out on his Twitter feed saying that this is not what he said. It was one of the most pro-Israel speeches ever made by a U.S. politician. And to say that Trump is using Jews, it's just a horrible, basically pushing the idea that it's a horrible trope for people to allege that Trump is using the Jewish people as a means to advantage himself.
Yes, and what was it? It's one of the sort of like, the hardcore Israeli press, Zionist press. One of them said, they don't like Trump because he's so narcissistic, and they called him some. We've been working on our Jerusalem headquarters for 2,000 years, and it was established by Ben Gurion in 49, I think, and it didn't just happen because some goy said it, and then there was, of course, the pushback to calling the president of the United States some goy, and so we're in this moment where this kind of, horseshoe Semitic, anti-Semitic kind of conversation is really being elevated.
It's like the person, I believe, from the Huffington Post who tweeted "Bye Goy" when Steve Bannon was taken out of the White House. So it's similar to that. And so anyway, back to Rick Wiles, and I think that this dream of civil war is a great context for what we're getting into here with this November 22nd broadcast. But I think this whole civil war rhetoric, and I'm sure it's been going on for a while with Wiles, but another overt example of this came about 2 or 3 months ago. In a clip that Right Wing Watch picked up of Wiles. And by the way, Right Wing Watch, Rick Wiles is definitely a favorite of those people. And Right Wing Watch is not exactly a media outlet that is very much seems to be about exposing the quotes of people who seem to be very genuine and very legitimate in terms of their opposition to various policies. In particular, a lot of the really overly crazy, you might call them Christian Zionist types who are just all about the apocalypse and the fantasies of these evil demonic Democrats are the kind of people that are promoted by Right Wing Watch. And Rick Wiles seems right at home in terms of all of the promotion he gets from that particular website. But in a clip from about 2 or 3 months ago, Rick Wiles was talking about how the left keeps pushing basically then you're going to get the mountain men, and you're going to get the patriots, and the officers and the other patriots are going to come out, and they're going to have their ammunition ready to wage war against these people. And so the way that it's spun by a lot of these people, by maybe supporters of an outlet like TruNews or other sources, is that, well, they're not actually encouraging a civil war. No, they're simply responding. The left are going to be the ones to start the civil war. They're laying out what's going to happen if the left actually makes this civil war a reality, and they're warning people that, the patriots are not going to take this lying down, and the patriots are going to respond in kind. And so that's the spin that's put on it.
And it sounds very much like the old school Alex Jones. Look, I'm not saying I want civil war, but you gotta get ready. The New World Order's coming for you. Don't want it, but if I don't seek it, I still will engage it.
And in some cases, as we're going to get into here, in some cases it's even more, it seems, overt than even the way Alex Jones puts it.
More realistic in a certain way, yeah.
Yes, very, very true, very true. But that's the way it's spun, is that, they don't want this, but they're telling you what's going to happen if you make it happen. But the way I see this is that this type of rhetoric from Wiles, the combination of this and what we're going to get into with this November 22nd broadcast, to me, it's just simply a classic tactic that we've seen so many times over the years. You're paving the way for the narrative to be put in place post some type of major, false flag style attack, to be blamed on, right-wing Trump supporting conservative Christian patriots. It's going to be, I think, my fear is that we're going to see much more of these Caesar Sayoc, a CNN bomb guy, sending all of these bombs to these various liberals, from George Soros to the Clintons on, and all with this van painted with all this graffiti of CNN being fake news and other talking points. I think my fear is that you're going to see more of this, and possibly some more violent manifestations of these type of you might call them psychological terrorist attacks in some ways. And the narrative is going to be that people like Rick Wiles and his ilk are radicalizing people to want to take this kind of action. And whether that's fair or not, and I certainly in a lot of cases, obviously, the way it's spun in so much of the media, it's not a fair characterization. But taking that aside, this is how it's going to be spun. And the Rick Wileses of this world, either wittingly or unwittingly, my suspicion is more of the former. I get the impression that Rick Wiles, personally, I get the impression he knows what he's doing with his with the rhetoric and the talking points he pushes, is that this is the type of boogeymen that are going to be used to justify the narratives that come in place after some major, hopefully not too major, but in the cases of more of these styles of attacks we've seen over the last couple of years, a combination of the Caesar Sayoc, CNN mail bomber, and then very real things like this Tree of Life synagogue event in Pittsburgh last year.
It does seem resonant also with the way that Wiles set up the quote-unquote Jew coup broadcast by actually saying the ADL is going to take this down. Obviously, it will be on our website. And so the way that he titled it, the way that he went ahead and did the analysis, if you want to call it that, seemed like it was meant to bring on the ADL, and also then at the same time as you get both sides of that kind of, stochastic, or the bringing on of censorship or deplatforming, is that those that support the ADL can point at the evil Jew hater Rick Wiles, who represents the anti-Zionist Christian community in the United States,
or even some people who don't support the ADL per se, like some on the left, maybe the pro-Palestinian left, who see the ADL as a Zionist propaganda organization, of course, which it is, but even people who are not inclined to even support types of operations like the ADL will support, in this case, the obvious need to be very vigilant against this kind of hate speech and the what they call hate speech and the consequences of it. So,
and then also those who might be sort of hyper focused on ADL suppression which is a very, very important and very real topic, will then will resonate with the oppression against Rick Wiles, like the groypers and allies and that whole group. So it creates a lot of grist for the propaganda mill across many different political backgrounds.
Absolutely, and it's very interesting that Wiles is making the ADL out to be the primary villain in all this. But when you listen to outlets like InfoWars or you listen to people from places like Breitbart, these obviously Zionist sources, they're pushing the idea that, well, the ADL used to be a reputable organization, but ever since this radical leftist Jonathan Greenblatt took over, it's just been used as like a social justice a weapon for social justice and a weapon against actual, Jewish patriots who are pro-Israel and pro-America. So,
and we were talking before we started, and this will be the last thing I say before I let you get back to the deep analysis of the quote-unquote Jew coup show, was that there's a resonance right now in terms of what you just pointed out back towards when the ADL came out with the alt-right versus alt-light list, both saying under the banner of the sort of the Trump sympathetic, quote unquote, white nationalist, white supremacist threat in the United States. And you had everyone from the Mike Cernoviches to the Richard Spencers. And so it looks like there's a recapitulation in many ways of that similar kind of thing that I would continue to say that it fits into what I might call a Jewish power pincher move in many ways. And so that even those who are, and I'm sure we'll flesh this out more either today or in the future. But the question of those that are sort of heavily anti-Jewish in a certain way, I see an analysis that shows that they are perfectly fitted into what Jewish power networks might actually want, where just a person, because they're Jewish, feels that they are potentially under threat by a whole political group of people, rather than actual analysis of politics and power.
I agree with you, and this is very important. And that what a lot of these people, like the Rick Wileses and others, do is that they tend to dehumanize their enemies to the point to where you don't see that these enemies of theirs are humans just like us and that they have human qualities. And that's obviously a big part of this. I think of a lot of the more overt, cartoonish anti-Jewish propagandas out there is that you dehumanize your enemy. And that is important. This is an important thing to know, to understand, is how, just how Jewish Americans, Jews in general, are being used and are kept in a constant state of fear and paranoia in a lot of cases. And you might even attest that in some cases it might even be more powerful than what some other groups face. I mean, you yourself being Jewish, Jeremy, but this is an important thing to go back to, I think, in the future, is the way that and part of this is the weaponization and the dehumanizing of your enemies, which in this case is, I think, in a lot of ways is the Jewish people in general. So.
And it makes it even more difficult, obviously. That's what it sort of tars the actual analysis that still needs to be done about the things that Rick Wiles points out about that the obvious indicators of overrepresentation of Jewish people in powerful positions, which is an obvious fact, and then that needs to be broken down and figured out in a way where it's not tarred and feathered and associated with just one sort of reactionary position. And that's why, I continue to hold out this question of holding down a radical middle position politically in relationship to doing some of this more difficult analysis.
Yes. So let's get into this November 22nd TruNews broadcast titled "Jew Coup: Seditious Jews Orchestrating Trump Impeachment Lynching." And in my last little bit of commentary before I really get into the meat and potatoes of this, is that when I started this program, I came up with the idea for the antidote, the title Antedote. To up the ante in terms of the conversations going on within the alternative media. And back in 2016, when I had this idea, I had no clue of just how pervasive and powerful I think the misleading propaganda out of so much of the alt media is. It's only been in the last couple of years since Trump was elected and then the aftermath of it that I've seen for myself just how pervasive this propaganda is. And I think you like me had some idea of this before the election, but I think for both of us this is really magnified over the last 2 to 3 years. But in starting this show, I think that in my idea for this program and what I had envisioned it to be originally, I think that this really fits into this context perfectly, as I think this is as much of an analysis, maybe counterintelligence analysis, as you call it sometimes, of the types of very deceptive talking points that are coming out of the alternative media that in many cases are just as bad and even in some cases worse than what you get from the traditional, CNN, NBC, CBS, Fox News style media.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into it. And as I said when we started, this is basically a reinforcement of pretty much every cartoonish depiction of the Jews as this all evil, all powerful entity that collectively are involved in a monolithic conspiracy to dominate the world. And one of the things that Rick Wiles does very effectively, and I think a lot of other people do this effectively, is that in laying out what he calls, and he really seems to zero in on Bolshevik, that this is a Bolshevik coup. And as we're going to talk about here, one of his main points out of this program is that if Trump is impeached, if these subversive, liberal, Bolshevik, Zionist, whatever combination you want to make it out to be, of Jews are successful in removing our duly constitutionally elected, I would add constitutionally Cambridge Analytica Breitbart conceived in Israel selected president, Donald Trump is removed.
Along with questions of actual election fraud that have been talked about much less than even Bush 2004.
For sure. And if our president is removed, then we're going to have a bloodletting, and the Bolshevik Revolution is really going to come to America. And Rick Wiles is basically saying that if we don't stop, if we, the Christian right-wing conservative patriots don't stop this impeachment coup, then there's going to be a massive bloodletting of millions of Christians in the streets. And in doing that, he brings out all of the nightmare scenarios of what has been portrayed ever since, fairly or unfairly, 1917 with the original Bolshevik Revolution and the takeover of Russia. And basically all of the worst nightmares of that Wiles is bringing to life with his depiction of this idea that there's going to be a mass purging, a mass murder execution of Christians, and the Donald Trump presidency at this point in time is the thing that is standing in the way of it, despite whatever is wrong with Trump. And yes, they talk about what's wrong with Trump, but in spite of that, we've got to continue to support him as our president who has the support of the Christian conservative populace. And one thing that Wiles does very effectively is he seamlessly goes from Zionist and goes from Israel, for example, just questions he asks, like, for example, is Adam Schiff sharing any of this intelligence with Israel? And he makes sure to mention the Zionist nature of people like Gerald Nadler. He mentions that Gerald Nadler is a Talmud expert, for example, in the context of discussing some of these Congress figures. But at the same time, he goes into going after anti-Zionists, such as the organization, the Jewish American quote-unquote peace organization, If Not Now, because If Not Now is critical of these depictions of George Soros as this all-powerful, Jewish Democrat, lizard man, whatever you want to call him, usurper of our society and supporter of all things evil. So that's one thing to see is the seamless transition from going after people who could be seen as obviously very Zionist and very pro-Israel to even people who are outside of the Democrat mainstream, who are not in line with, in many cases, the Adam Schiffs and Gerald Nadlers of the world, and who are very critical for whatever whatever questions there are about organizations like If Not Now. Let's take that out for right now. They're very critical of the Israeli domination of Palestine and the oppression of the Palestinian people. You just seamlessly throw them in with the overt, obvious pro-Israel Zionists as part of this monolithic Jewish conspiracy to destroy all that's good and right in the world. And so that was a constant reiterated narrative throughout this program. And Rick Wiles is very effectively at seamlessly going through these talking points and seamlessly just linking people that really don't have that much in common as part of a monolithic conspiracy, just because of the fact that really they have a J in front of their name of their ethnicity, and they just happen to dislike Donald Trump.
And there seems to be also some aspect where there's not good actual faith in terms of the politics here, because you would think that if the anti-Zionism that Wiles says he's come to, and remember we pointed out how recent at some level this is after he helped set up the massive Christian Zionist propaganda networks, within the last few decades. And
Yes.
then even just years ago, calling for nuking Muslim capitals and that whole aspect that was going on even up into the 2016 election season, that you would think that there would be, if that were really serious, this anti-Zionist, real Christian American position that Wiles has come to, that he would actually be pointing out the types of things that we've been pointing out, that what's really going on here is that there's a Zionist limited hangout that the Democrats are doing in relationship to how much of a Zionist agent Trump actually is. And it seems at some level that there is this aspect of the Russian connection that potentially might be one of, if not a key stumbling block in relationship to calling this out. Because that's obviously what's happening here, is Nancy Pelosi actually slow rolled and is limiting, and at this point is actually speed rolling, so that it looks like to me, and I've been saying it, that it looks like the point of this is to limit the scope of the impeachment inquiry so that it does not deal with the types of things that Rick Wiles would actually be interested supposedly in uncovering, like such as the level of Zionist commitment that the Democrats have, and how Israeli-centric what's been titled Trump Russia is actually really was. And it's not because the Russian component was not real. It's because it was only a piece of a larger global conspiracy that was very much Zionist and very much Israeli. And so to me, it doesn't make sense politically that in these key moments, Wiles then just hunkers down around the sort of the false idol that has been dangled in front of the Christian right.
Yes, and just to clarify, we talked about this before when we talked about Wiles, but the Christian Zionist propaganda empires that Wiles was instrumental in really bringing into the public eye on a very massive level. It's even talked about in Rick Wiles' biography on the TruNews website. Is of course the first one was the Christian Broadcasting Network, which is Pat Robertson's company, which airs the 700 Club, which that is, when you think of like Christian Zionist evangelical television, you think of the 700 Club and Pat Robertson. Rick Wiles was the licensing director, I want to say, for the Christian Broadcasting Network, and he got, through his deals that he made, Christian Broadcasting Network, what became the Family Channel, onto so many of the major cable platforms during the rise of cable television in the early to mid 80s. And then fast forward about a decade later, when satellite television became prominent, Rick Wiles, working in the same capacity for the Trinity Broadcasting Network, which broadcasts a who's who of Christian Zionist propaganda, from John Hagee to Kenneth Copeland to pretty much anyone else you have in mind who you know of as like a Christian Zionist evangelical televangelist. Wiles was also involved in getting contracts for Trinity Broadcasting Network to get on all of the major satellite forms. And to this day, I can say this from living with my dad for a while, that the networks that reach into these that Trinity Broadcasting, along with like one or two other channels, those are the channels that are on television for the obvious Christian, Zionist evangelical base as television for them to that they believe represents their values. So Rick Wiles is instrumental in the rise of both of these evangelical television media empires, and so I wanted to put that out there. And then with what you were saying about the nature and the scope of this impeachment inquiry and it being limited, honestly, by the Democrats, it seems like in so many ways, is that, and that is one of the things that's important here. And Rick Wiles, on a few occasions, brought up Russia in a very, very sympathetic way, is that the MO of Wiles, one of his MOs, appears to be to just blame everything on Israel and Jews, and that everything Trump does that's bad that he doesn't like, while ultimately running cover for him, is in the context of either being pro-Israel because he's compromised in some way. He's alluded to what we talked about that's out there with Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein being accused of raping a then 13-year-old Katie Johnson, in that case that was very quickly swept under the rug, it seems like. But also in terms of Trump, either he's blackmailed or compromised in some way, but he's also being manipulated by the likes of Jared Kushner, which is an obvious trope that all of these very anti-Jewish types push. David Duke has constantly pushed the idea that Trump is being manipulated by Jared Kushner to do what the Jews want him to do. But in this Israel-centric, Jewish-centric narrative, when it does come to the bad things that Trump actually is doing, then it leaves out entirely this Eastern component, which not only is Russia in this very manufactured way that the media portrays this Russia threat, in this kind of over-the-top, very Cold War 2.0 like manner of just making everything about Russian trolls and Russian spies that are out to destroy America because there's truth to that, but it's also very weaponized in the way that the establishment, quote-unquote, anti-Trump media covers it. But taking out entirely this Eastern component, which not only is about Russia, but is about this global organized crime syndicate that Donald Trump has been joined at the hip with ever since his rise to prominence within the terms of the New York business, real estate, casino businesses, going back to the 70s and 80s, and obviously even going back to his father, Fred Trump, and the close relationships with people like Roy Cohn. So this is left out almost entirely of this narrative that Wiles and others like him are pushing, that there was no wrongdoing in Ukraine. And even Wiles will push this narrative that there was nothing wrong done in Ukraine, to the point to where he almost comes out as a defender of arch 9/11 conspirator, obvious Zionist agent Rudy Giuliani. And that in another broadcast that I was listening to that I heard an excerpt from, Wiles was saying that if Giuliani had been the attorney general all along, then these deep state Democrats would have been exposed. And Wiles even pushed the idea that Giuliani was almost manipulated or coerced into by investigating via these Jewish Ukrainians associates who were arrested. Lev Parmas, and there was another one. Do you remember the name?
Igor Fruman.
Okay, via Lev Parnas and Igor Furman.
I think it's Parnas with an N.
Parnas, yeah. Okay. Parnas and Furman, that Giuliani was basically manipulated or led to investigate what they wanted him to investigate rather than what Giuliani actually wants them to investigate. So even in the process of this, you get cover ran for odious figures like Rudy Giuliani, or in the case of someone like Reese Stranahan at Sputnik, you get cover ran for people like Roger Stone and Paul Manafort. So in this leaving out of this Eastern narrative, I think it gives you a very limited scope of what is actually appears to be at play with this Trump phenomenon, and just how heavy the Zionist factor is for Trump, not just Israeli, but globally. And also,
this September 11th, New York, geographical New York connection to the Trump mob is so glaring and also still so left out. Because I'm also thinking of, like you pointed out, Giuliani, and then there's also the question of all of the people that are backing Trump for pardoning the war criminals who, in some cases, all of their fellow soldiers or fellow SEALs believe that these guys were war criminals, and yet that's sort of seen as Trump sort of sticking it to the liberal snowflakes who don't appreciate our warrior class. And who is there with Eddie Gallagher but Bernard Kerik, i.e., right, along with Giuliani, Bernard Kerik, and we covered this in our from 9/11 to 11/9 series. Bernard Kerik is in Israel, interfacing with Israeli intelligence, interfacing with people like Eitan Wertheimer, tied into the Talpiot high technology program in the weeks leading up to September 11th. And so people might want to go back and look at that. And so Eddie Gallagher is then out in public, very mobby kind of scenarios with Bernard Kerik and Mark Mukasey, i.e. the son of one of the key, if not the key, 9/11 attorney of ultimately Bush Attorney General Michael Mukasey.
Indeed, and that reminds me of another person that Wiles was praising in this podcast, and that's Joseph diGenova, Joe diGenova, the one of the attorneys for Firtash, correct? Him and
correct.
His wife Victoria Tensing, of course, along with the Clinton side of the horseshoe. Firtash also being represented by Lanny Davis. I believe he's currently he has been in the past represented by the Clintonite attorney Lanny Davis. But in this broadcast, Rick Wiles describes Joe diGenova as being persecuted, and he has all these liberal Jews wanting to get him out of Fox News because he criticized George Soros on air. I kept thinking during the show, are you going to portray Victoria Tensing, a Scooter, our Iraq war proto-archetype, Scooter Libby, who was pardoned by Trump via the legal work of people like Joe diGenova's wife, Victoria Tensing? Are you going to portray her as being a persecuted patriot while you're at it? So that was another person who Wiles managed to run cover for.
And one might want to go look back at the Joseph diGenova's key role in the prosecution of Pollard, and whether that was also that his role was to actually limit the hangout of the scope of the prosecution in relationship to how deep the Pollard breach really was, and how it went right past and through Israeli intelligence into the Soviets' intelligence sphere, which supposedly is where the massive fallout of over 1,000 U.S. intelligence assets, at the very least, in the European context and beyond, were apparently killed.
Yeah, and it's interesting how Joe diGenova's primary and his wife's primary allies in the media, despite diGenova's primary role in helping to prosecute Pollard and his ongoing advocacy to this day that Jonathan Pollard should not be released, that he poses a national security threat to America. It's interesting that some of his foremost supporters are people who are very much advocates of freeing Jonathan Pollard and advocates of everything else that is all about this shift to this super right-wing hawkish Zionism that we're really see being manifested under Trump. People like Mark Levin, the Edwin Meese, Iran-Contra promise scandal era protege. It's all these people like that seem to be Joe diGenova and his wife's biggest allies, which I think is kind of funny.
Yes, very much.
So anyway, in context of Russia, Rick Wiles on 2 or 3 different occasions throws in the fact that Vladimir Putin said in an interview that Jews may have actually interfered in the election and not Russians. So this reinforces, I think, what is a constant TruNews narrative, that Putin is actually standing up for the good in the world, and that Putin is standing for traditional values and things that are moral and good, in contrast to what the degenerate Zionist Bolsheviks want. And so we've had all of these people mentioned as being the epitome of this Jew coup against Trump. Gerald Nadler, Adam Schiff, even organizations like If Not Now that are very anti-Zionist. George Soros himself, who we've broken down. I don't think Rick Wiles will ever mention the names. Of Arthur Finkelstein in relation to George Soros and the anti-Soros narrative that's really been weaponized big time by places like Fox News and obviously InfoWars and others, that he so effectively pushes Soros as the epitomizing of the Zionist Bolshevik conspiracy.
And I just want to point out, in terms of If Not Now, that if they were actually to be properly critiqued, it wouldn't be from a anti-Bolshevik perspective. It'd be that they're actually not anti-Zionists, but they are on the sort of liberal to progressive limited hangout of critiquing the current policies of Zionism. So, but of course, Rick Wiles is not going to do that kind of analysis.
Agreed. And also in the context of defending the congressman from Ohio, Jim Jordan, who was at that Israeli-American Council event that Trump spoke at over the weekend, along with, I believe he said, Michael Waltz of Florida, who was one of Dick Cheney's top advisors in Afghanistan prior to becoming a congressman elected in the state of Florida. In the process of defending Jim Jordan from the horrible Alexander Vindman, military figure who testified against Trump in the during the hearings the last couple of weeks. In the process of defending Jordan, he has to point out Alexander Vindman's Jewishness and how there's these Jewish twins working in the National Security Council. It made me think, well, have you ever talked about Ezra Cohen Watnick and all that he represented in the Trump administration? My guess would be no. But the Vindmans were recruited, basically they were groomed because this elderly Jewish photographer has been taking photos of them since the 1980s, and they managed to get into the highest levels of the American government, of the American military establishment, and now they're coming after our duly elected President Trump. I quipped in the notes I was taking for the show, it's very similar to how Donald Trump was propped up by like the worst of the New York tabloid press going back to the 1970s. If you want to talk about grooming, but basically anybody, it's part of this narrative that anyone almost that opposes Trump for any reason, regardless of what their motivations are. And there's also people like Fiona Hill, who, to my knowledge, is not Jewish, who's a primary figure in this in the counter narrative to the impeachment narrative going on within the media. People like Fiona Hill and the one who frickin' Lee Stranahan constantly talks about, Ali Chalupa. There's allusions to these people as being at the center of the anti-Trump conspiracy, or obviously people like Peter Strzok and his girlfriend, so to speak, Lisa Page, and the other one, Bruce Orr, who actually was investigating the Semyon Mogilevich organized crime syndicate. These people, I don't think there's any hard evidence of their like overt allegiances to Zionism or even to what we would know as like Jewish causes in general, but they're still seamlessly thrown in with these to this bigger monolithic conspiracy by these subversive Jews to remove Trump for all that's good in the world. The narrative that anybody who opposes Trump for pretty much any reason is like this, is working for demonic interests and has to be dehumanized, has to be exposed for being these agents of this evil, and so,
all while running cover or ignoring the actual material inheritors of the actual Bolshevik deep state, i.e. Vladimir Putin, who took over the architecture of the former KGB, was KGB colonel, but then turns it into this, whatever comes after, however you want to typify it. But it's the same apparatus. And then the intellectual godfather, Dugin, who was an actual Bolshevik, was a self-proclaimed Bolshevik, and yet somehow they're actually allies. It seems like to someone like Wiles in his so-called anti-Bolshevik counter-coup operation.
Right, and by extension, obvious Zionists like Steve Bannon become their allies, at least when it comes to things like, the restoring of traditionalism to our society, and just by painting Trump as like this victim because he has the support of the Christians, that if he's removed and Christians don't fight for him, then they're going to be mass exterminated by the Bolsheviks. And as much criticism as you might do of like the nature of Christian Zionism and the false, misleading evangelical Zionism that is kind of very much subverted, you could say, Christianity in recent decades, when you do that, it's like you're not providing context of the fakeness of this in the aspect of trying to expose this coup against Trump as meaning all Christians have to stand by him. But in the process of that, you're reiterating that these followers of this very subversive element of Christianity are that there's still like that because Trump pays lip service to them and dog whistles to them that, they have to defend him as their guy, when in reality, I would say that, they're being misled by these same forces that Rick Wiles is constantly pushing back against, i.e. the Christian evangelical Zionists.
It's a good point, Greg, because it's also like that from a religious perspective. It's like instead of pointing out that the false god is a false god, or pointing out that the idol, the golden calf, or the idol is just an idol, instead it's trying to like do things to like prop up. My image was like of like a statue of Trump, like similar to the statue of Saddam Hussein that was being pulled down. And the question is keeping it hoisted, keeping the golden statue of the sort of fake god idol that's really was marketed largely to the evangelical right in a way that we at the time we called out that this was a spiritual compromise operation, a spiritual blackmail operation in the way that Trump was sold to the religious right, especially with the whole background and of the grooming, the New York grooming, and his whole so-called playboy background and the pussy grabbing and that whole thing, that instead of really breaking down the idol, Rick Wiles chooses to try to continue to prop the idol up so that the people that he's talking about, the guys in the hills or the people in the living rooms who he knows what they're actually saying, are not going to go into a hot war. No, if you really were concerned about that, you'd be actually carefully dissecting for your people, for the people that you see as your people, how they got duped by this false idol.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. And I think that'll figure into what we're going to, I think what I want to zero in on as we close this program, which is the very similar narratives that are being pushed throughout the complex of media that is against against this impeachment process, whether it's the establishment Republicans or whether it's the what's called the anti-imperialist left, as exemplified by the people like Jimmy Dore, for example, is the very symmetrical and a very strange but very much a continuous way of the very similar media narratives that are being pushed with different talking points. We'll get to that before we end. But as we start to wrap up here, I think we should get into what was discussed right at the end of this November 22nd Jew Coup stream, which
Quote,
is
unquote,
Rick
Jew
Wiles.
Coup rhymes with buku. Yeah,
indeed it does. Where Rick Wiles brings the issue of Benjamin Netanyahu's indictment and possible impending removal from office. Do you want to describe this? Because you've kind of compared it to the arguments Alex Jones makes about the Trump-Netanyahu relationship. Would you like to maybe break this down a little bit and then we can comment on it?
It's almost a complete parallel that Alex Jones was running around the time of the transition into the Trump administration, around the time where I made the call into his show where he said that I was mental illness, just because I was bringing up the facts of Louis Eisenberg, 9/11, Genie Energy, all of that type of stuff. And then somehow that makes me mental illness. It was right at that time that Alex Jones was also beginning to run parallels. Remember, this is also the same time as where Jerome Corsi and people like Jerome Corsi was starting to talk about how levels above Israeli military, Israeli intelligence were directly, he was connected directly to them, and that they wanted to nominate Trump for the Peace Prize, and that they supported Alex Jones.
That we have asserted that this might be a combination of the mega group of Jewish Zionist American billionaires combined with some of these international organized crime entities who would be very connected to organizations like the B'nai B'rith, who Jerome Corsi did work for at least in the 90s.
And combined with the mega secret group called AL, which is very rarely reported in the press. There is some reporting in two books that I'm aware of. One of Victor Ostrovsky's book mentions Al, which is the Israeli intelligence insertion into specifically around North America, and compromising and creating moles and recruiting and propaganda, and then also it is in what's his name? I think it's in some aspect of Gideon's Spies by Gordon Thomas. I think it's in that book too, the reference to Al, and it literally means above Israeli intelligence. So I think, yeah, in that combination of mega group, Al, and the transnational mob syndicate, the Meyer-Lansky, but then connected to the Red Mafia of the East, that is probably what's being described there by Jerome Corsi. But at that time, Alex Jones was beginning to make the linkage that as Netanyahu there was the inklings of Netanyahu's corruption scandal, and he was going to be investigated, and it was George Soros, the evil George Soros, his networks that were going to try to take down Netanyahu, and there was a linkage that Alex Jones made to Trump, that these guys are, together, and it was so interesting, to hear Wiles like 3 years later making a very similar replica of an argument, and it's much more delicate for him to do it because he's supposedly an anti-Zionist. He supposedly is dealing with the threat of Israeli high technology, and yet he obviously notices, yes, okay, Netanyahu said he's the victim of a deep state coup, that's the real reason he's under indictment and investigation of corruption charges, just like Donald Trump.
Yes, and Wiles as being somebody who says, he doesn't like Netanyahu, but he also adds that he's praying for Netanyahu. That's very sweet of you, Rick, that you want his soul to be saved, and to come to Christianity. But whatever.
I wonder if Rick Wiles will read that Finks Bar quote from Netanyahu, or will do any investigation about Netanyahu's role in New York City in the 80s in terms of relationships with both Trump and Jonathan Pollard at the very same time. And also potentially the question of what do the files that Vladimir Putin holds have to say about not only Trump, but also about Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yes, you mean those files that RT and Sputnik are totally exposing to the world, right? Anyway, I digress. But I mean, one important caveat between Wiles and Alex Jones is that Alex Jones just pushes the idea, that Trump and Netanyahu, they're spiritual brothers, and that they, along with Putin, I mean, I've heard Alex Jones talk about Trump, Netanyahu, and Putin as all being nationalists who want to protect their countries from, globalism or whatnot, where Alex Jones will say that, they're coming after Netanyahu because Netanyahu represents what Trump represents, which is nationalism and all of this. And if they remove, his quote, I believe, was, if they remove Netanyahu, they're coming for Trump next. Rick Wiles will provide the caveat that because there's all this pressure against Trump and Netanyahu, that they might be tempted to start a war. So in the context of portraying Trump and Netanyahu as these almost brothers in arms who are united against this, who have a common enemy in terms of wanting to see them removed from their respective offices, Wiles, instead of going the overtly, Trump and Netanyahu, or Netanyahu's a good guy just like Trump who's fighting for what's good in the world, is that he'll provide the caveat that, well, Trump might be forced to start a war as a means to maybe get some of the pressure off of him. So,
yes, but also Wiles even admits, he's like, I'm uncomfortable with this, in terms of Netanyahu, but I begin to rethink whether he's actually telling the truth about this, that this is a coup against him internally, and and sort of the implication is sort of similar actually to what Alex Jones says, is yes, that Netanyahu is actually a nationalist like Trump, and that's why, the sort of internationalist Bolshevik Jew conspiracy, in Wiles' place, he actually would sort of say that directly. In Alex's case, it would be more sort of the dog whistling of the George Soros,
the global communist Muslim Mecca Mecha Chi-Com conspiracy.
They hate their nationalism. It's because Netanyahu's a nationalist, just like Trump. They're just too good.
And just like Putin. Don't forget Putin.
Putin, yeah, right.
Remember, it was Jerome Corsi, who's seen as an Israeli agent, and I think probably rightly so, who on one of his since deleted live streams was talking about how Vladimir Putin wants to defeat communism and how Trump should align with them. So,
Yeah.
and so I guess we did talk about Wiles's overt rhetoric and his descriptions of like the Civil War coming to America and the bloodletting if the Jew coup removes our democratically elected constitutionally Cambridge Analytica Breitbart conceived in Israel president.
Paul Manafort.
Yes.
With the potential Mike Connell post-mortem back end.
Ken Blackwell. Ohio Secretary of State in 2004. But if he's removed the overt language of the bloodletting that's going to be let out, and then also the response from the patriots and the mountain men and the rural American conservative Christians who are going to respond in kind to this, we've among ourselves, we've talked about how this seems to be more overt than even what Alex Jones is willing to say, whereas Jones obviously has for years been talking about the inevitable, the imminent imprisoning of patriotic Americans in FEMA camps or however else he wants to describe it, which of course is a combination of removing Trump and also taking away our gun rights and the right to basically support Israel on college campuses. I mean, which should be fought for, but for different reasons, obviously. I don't support censorship in that regard either, but just the ways that Jones will portray the threat coming to us. But much like how Wiles back in 2014 seemed to me to be much more overt and open in his language as far as nuking Muslim holy sites than even like the John Hagees and the obvious most bloodthirsty of like the false Christian Zionist Israel worshipping televangelist evangelicals. It seems to me in this context that Wiles is more overt than people like Alex Jones in his descriptions of what will happen if they destroy our president and they get their way.
And it's what's interesting about it too is it does have a feel where it's not as sort of, maybe I would say, Hollywoodized as Alex Jones used to play the role. And of course, Alex Jones was in the Richard Linklater films and was connected to Hollywood, and so he played and plays a role. And I don't think it's necessarily that Rick Wiles is not playing a role also, but there's a sense of it. It seems more, if the difference were between sort of like from like a Hollywood fictional production to something more like the Blair Witch Project or cinema verite when it comes to someone like Rick Wiles, is that the sense, the agit propaganda style and content of it feels a little bit more real at some way, in terms of, you can imagine when he's talking about his dream of the U.S. Of a U.S. War-fighting plane flying overhead, and that there's some kind of coup or civil war, and yet he's also realistically promising Nancy Pelosi now that he is stockpiled. He is now has to, because she's promising what I believe was probably going to be a fairly milquetoast, limited hangout, probably potentially unsuccessful attempt to impeach the president. Maybe not. Maybe something else will happen. But that because of that, Rick Wiles has to promise Nancy Pelosi that he is now stockpiling the ammo, he's now stockpiling the food, and he's now stockpiling the medical supplies because people are going to bleed and I need to take care of my family and maybe others. And that he's like, you may not hear what these people are, people don't say these things online, but we're talking to them in their homes, in their kitchens, in their living rooms. And I got to let you know that, that this is the real mood of the country. And yet, meanwhile, if you really look at our country, it is very, and of course, we continue to try to break this aspect down. We are sitting ducks politically by any kind of desired disruptor or someone trying to weaponize our politics against us, whether domestic or foreign, because of the intensity of our bipartisan system, the idea of left-right politics. And so, but at the same time, the country, in terms of talking about it as a civil war, no state in the entire country voted for Trump more than, 2/3 of the population, right? And so this is not a civil war kind of scenario. If anything, it's exactly as you started, Greg. That what this really is creating the agit propaganda circumstances for the rollout of what will be called stochastic terrorism of the Caesar Sayoc type, whereas once again Rick Wiles predicted would happen in saying this in his more recent show is that, or Doc, well maybe it was Doc who said it, that what will happen is that some angry right-wing, maybe Christian person is going to do something, and then it will be then sort of open season. And so I think that's really what this is, the danger in this kind of agit propaganda that Wiles is putting forth at this moment is not because it's actually a civil war moment any more than like the dozens and dozens and dozens of FEMA camp moments that Alex Jones promised us through the years turned out to be correct in that way, but it is the setting up of exactly what they said, which is the question of events, either false flag constructions, generated crises, fully synthetic, or something more like stochastic terrorism, where someone believes the hype and is trying to pop the thing off and stuff like that. So that's really the issue. So meanwhile, I would pray for Rick Wiles to dig deep into the truth, and that justice is truth in action. If you skip the truth, then you just have some kind of agit propaganda posing as divine justice. So help us uncover the actual truth that's going on here. And the truth is that it's much, much worse about Donald Trump than what the Democrats are going to tell you.
And in the process of exposing Donald Trump, you expose a lot of the other side that he is agitating so much propaganda against. But if it's not going to come from Rick Wiles or Doc Burkhart, then maybe someone like Edward Zoll, the TruNews correspondent who has put out, I think, a lot of the best work that TruNews has done on topics related to going on the ground at the Tesoro Ranch in New Mexico, Jeffrey Epstein's compound, or some of the Talpiot high technological treason related topics that TruNews has covered in recent months.
And Zoll was the one, it looks like, he was the one who did the research. He was the one who put that forward, the Talpiot research, in a highly credible, highly journalistic fashion, not with all of the intense hype that Wiles even at that time was trying to add to it. And then also, I believe it was Zoll who was the one who did some really interesting analysis in terms of the Epstein connection to Ronald Lauder, and whether Epstein had gotten his fake passport with the Austrian fake passport with the Saudi place of residence on it from Lauder. So I agree with you in terms of inviting Edward Zoll to step up and out of this kind of agit propaganda matrix.
For sure. And as we start to wrap up here, I guess the last thing I want to get into is just the symmetry of these very, at least ostensibly diametrically opposed media outlets and their philosophies, and where they happen to be covering the political divide and the events going on in Washington from, is this symmetrical similarity in it's very weirdly symmetrical. It doesn't make any sense on the surface, but when you really look at it closer, I think it makes a lot of sense. Just the similar narratives, and in the case of the right wing, some of the almost lockstep narratives that are coming out in terms of rhetoric and just difference of wording of things. Like, for example, Rick Wiles refers to Adam Schiff in this program as being very shifty-eyed. And, that's something I've heard as I've been on car rides lately and heard a lot more talk radio than I'm used to hearing as of late, or that I want to hear. Sean Hannity has described Adam Schiff in the same way, to the point that my mother talks about how Adam Schiff is shifty-eyed. So there's some very similar narratives, but whether it's coming from the obvious, very Zionist Fox News, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Breitbart, Mark Levin angle of things, obviously very heavily Zionist, and they wear their Zionism on their sleeves, their defense of Trump, or whether it comes from these very much within the Zionist milieu, but also seen as being a little bit outside of that box, like InfoWars, or even more so than InfoWars, seemingly Tucker Carlson in their respective narratives, or whether you move to Lee Stranahan at Sputnik, who we've talked about a lot, in his defense of Trump, or whether you just get into like the overtly anti-Jewish David Duke, Rick Wiles style defenses of Trump. You have almost a very lockstep narrative among all of these people that Trump is the victim of this deep state witch hunt coup against him. I mean, David Duke describes it as a crucifixion. He says that Trump is not Christ, but they hate him just the same. So that's kind of almost similar to Wiles, just that Duke comes at it from a more race-based perspective than Rick Wiles does, who does not seem to overtly emphasize race in his commentaries, but rather religion. But whether it's the overt Zionists at Fox News and Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Breitbart, Mark Levin milieu, or to the ostensibly diametrically opposed David Dukes and Rick Wileses of the world, the narrative is almost exactly the same. They just use different words. While I think a lot of, quote, woke people who are into the alt media, who understand the Zionist threat and understand a lot of the problems with Trump, whereas they can see the subversiveness of someone like Alex Jones talking about FEMA camps and demonizing various groups. When Rick Wiles, someone like him, adds on the magic J word that other people will not say, such as the folks who just want to talk about like the Democrats or the deep state or the liberals, like the Tucker Carlsons, or the more overt, obvious Zionists. It seems that when Rick Wiles puts on the magic J word, it's harder for some people to see the subversiveness in the propaganda coming from his milieu. And then one more thing I want to throw in is that even I mentioned before people like Jimmy Dore, Aaron Matei on the left, who have been the primary pushers back within the left media aspect of the Russiagate narrative. Basically, they thumb their noses at anything having to do with Russia as being just pointless. It's nonsensical. It's not true. Trump's guilty of all these other things, but the Russia hoax is designed to distract attention away from Donald Trump's real crimes, which is just basically a left dog whistle to the narratives in place of racism and white supremacism and class struggle. In their own way, the narrative is pretty similar in the way that, leftists are described, or like the Democrat establishment is described. While it's obviously not the weaponized, demonic narratives that you get from some of these right-wing outlets, it's still similar in that they're, in a strange way, they're fighting the same enemy. And at the end of the day, all of these entities are ultimately running cover for the same interest. And it's very fascinating. It does not appear that way on the surface, but when you look at it closer, I think very strong case can be made for this being what is going on.
Yes. And so I would just point out, from 11/9 to 9/11, or 9/11 to 11/9, if you want to think about it chronologically, the horseshoe aspect of the cover-up is a very interesting thing to behold. And so, yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the sort of parallel of the usage of the words of these magical phrases, whether it's the J words or whether it's the deep state. And so this is one of the things that we really have worked to do at the Antedote, is to not use words carefully, but to develop concepts using words that can remind us what these words actually mean. For example, the deep state. We keep reminding people, in the midst of it sort of becoming a sort of magic word to the sort of pro-Trump right, to becoming a sort of laughing sort of term taken on by the mainstream left, if you want to put it like that, that in the middle of that is still this analysis of someone like Peter Dale Scott, of the actual meaning of the deep state, of the linkage and the nexus of the national security apparatus, most especially the covert operations aspect, the deep intelligence aspect of it, with the criminal mob black economy world, and that is increasingly, of course, transnational. All right, so that's one thing, and then of course just using it correctly is as something, and so we might even then be able to say things such as, all right, if there is some aspect of the deep state in the U.S. that opposes Trump, I would actually say it's actually the permanent state that it opposes Trump, i.e. the national security apparatus that persists beyond politics, which in some cases is part of the deep state. But then there's another thing that's supporting Trump, and maybe that's the deeper state. I don't know. So, but thank you, Greg, so much for guiding us through this analysis of that broadcast.
And thank you for doing this with me. I think I got most of the points I wanted to make out in the context of this, and you certainly definitely with your own analysis and some of your findings from this particular program, I think certainly brought a lot to the table for conversation for this. So yeah, I'm glad we got this out, and I hope that everybody gets something out of this and just start maybe paying attention to the types of rhetoric that are being pushed that are ostensibly very different, but really, I think particularly when it comes to the right wing media apparatus and activism apparatus is almost exactly in lockstep with what the Rick Wileses and the David Dukes and people of their ilk are pushing. So they just use different buzzwords for their audiences with a combination of a lot of the same buzzwords. So anyway, until next time.
Thank you, Greg. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.